Welcome back to XRP Update. I'm glad you're here because today we're going to look at a comparison that has a lot of investors talking. This isn't about telling you what to buy or giving financial advice. Instead, we're simply going to examine the numbers, compare the potential returns, and let the math speak for itself. Let's begin with a simple assumption. If XRP were to reach a price of $10, an investor buying around current levels would be looking at roughly a 9 times return, or close to an 800% gain. Now think about what would have to happen for another major investment opportunity to deliver that exact same return over the same period. The numbers become very interesting, and that's what we're breaking down today. As I'm recording this update, it's June 2026, and the markets have been moving quickly. XRP has recovered from its recent pullback, while another highly discussed investment has entered the public markets with an enormous valuation. Instead of focusing on headlines or emotions, let's simplify everything and compare the opportunity using basic mathematics. For today's discussion, I'm using rounded figures to make the calculations easy to follow. XRP currently sits at approximately a $70 billion market capitalization, while the other investment opportunity we're comparing is valued at roughly $1.75 trillion. When you place those two numbers side by side, an important question naturally comes up. Which one has more room to grow from today's levels? Before answering that, let's understand how market capitalization actually works. Many people only focus on price, but price alone doesn't tell the full story. The number of tokens or shares in circulation matters just as much because market capitalization is simply the current price multiplied by the circulating supply. For XRP, we're working with roughly 62 billion tokens currently in circulation. At today's price, that gives us a market capitalization of around $70 billion. Now imagine XRP reaching $10 per coin. Using the same circulating supply, the market capitalization would increase to approximately $620 billion. At first glance, that sounds like an enormous number. $600 billion is certainly significant. But when you step back and consider the size of the global financial system, international payments, tokenized assets, and the markets that blockchain technology is attempting to serve, the figure becomes much easier to understand. In fact, many supporters argue that it represents only a small fraction of the opportunity that exists. Of course, there is another variable that deserves attention. The circulating supply of XRP today is around 62 billion, but over time that number can increase. The total supply is 100 billion tokens, and while it's unlikely that the entire amount will suddenly enter circulation, it's still worth considering a more conservative scenario. Even if we calculate everything using the full 100 billion token supply, a $10 XRP would still imply a valuation of approximately $1 trillion. That's certainly a large figure, but it's not impossible when viewed within the context of global finance. More importantly, whether we use the current circulating supply or the fully diluted supply, the overall investment thesis doesn't really change. And that's because the comparison becomes even more fascinating once we examine what would be required for another investment to generate the same percentage return. That's where the numbers start telling a very different story. Now let's continue with the comparison because this is where the numbers become even more interesting. Even if we take the most conservative approach and assume XRP needs to support a valuation of around $1 trillion to reach a $10 price, the overall argument still doesn't change. In fact, it strengthens it. Why? Because when we compare the same potential return to another investment, the scale of growth required becomes dramatically different. Let's look at the numbers. The company we're comparing recently entered the public markets with a valuation of approximately $1.75 trillion, making it one of the largest public offerings we've ever seen. It was a historic event, and there's no denying the achievement. But if an investor buying today expects the same return that a move from today's XRP price to $10 would provide, then that valuation would need to increase by roughly 9 times. That means we're no longer talking about a company worth around $2 trillion. We're talking about a valuation approaching $15 to $16 trillion. Take a second and think about how massive that number really is. Eventually, we may very well see companies reach valuations like that. Markets continue to evolve, technology advances, and history has shown that what seems impossible today can become normal tomorrow. But the real question isn't whether it can ever happen. The question is whether it is likely to happen within the same time frame that XRP could potentially move to a $10 price. Let's even make the comparison as conservative as possible. Suppose XRP doesn't reach $10 next year. Suppose it takes 3 years or even 5 years. Many investors believe it could happen sooner, but let's ignore optimism and use a longer timeline. If it takes 5 years for XRP to achieve that target, then the other investment would also need to multiply its valuation by approximately 9 times during those same 5 years, just to deliver an equivalent return. That's an extraordinary challenge. We're not talking about setting a new company record. We're talking about creating an entirely new level of valuation that financial markets have never witnessed before. It would require surpassing today's biggest corporations by an enormous margin. And I want to be very clear here. This is not an attack on the company or on its leadership. Quite the opposite. What they've accomplished is remarkable and deserves recognition. Revolutionary companies deserve credit for changing industries and pushing innovation forward. The point of today's discussion is simply about probability. If someone asks where today's investment dollars may have greater upside potential, we should compare realistic growth expectations rather than emotional excitement. History has already shown that digital assets have reached hundreds of billions of dollars in market capitalization. We've seen it happen before. Bitcoin has done it. Other major cryptocurrencies have done it as well. So the idea of XRP reaching several $100 billion, or even approaching $1 trillion over time, is something that can at least be analyzed using historical precedent. Many traditional investors struggle with this concept because they're used to valuing businesses through earnings, cash flow, and conventional financial models. Digital assets operate differently. Their value is tied to network effects, liquidity, adoption, and utility. That's why many people were shocked when XRP previously reached valuations they thought were impossible, yet the market proved otherwise. And that's why understanding market capitalization instead of simply focusing on price is so important. The conversation isn't just about whether a token can reach a certain number. It's about whether the overall valuation required is reasonable within the size of the market it aims to serve. Once you start looking at the comparison from that perspective, the gap between the two opportunities becomes much easier to understand, and the investment thesis starts looking very different than it does from the headlines alone. So, when everything is said and done, this comparison really comes down to one simple question. Which opportunity has the greater probability of delivering the return you're looking for from today's levels? Everyone has to answer that for themselves. I'm not telling you what to buy, and this is certainly not financial advice. I'm simply looking at the numbers, comparing the market caps, and asking which scenario appears more realistic over the next few years. For me, the answer is pretty clear, and that's why I continue to focus on XRP rather than chasing the latest hype. But I genuinely love to hear your opinion. Let me know in the comments what you think and why. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to XRP Update, hit the notification bell, and share this video with anyone who might find it valuable. Thank you so much for watching. Stay informed, stay patient, and I'll see you in the next update.